It is our second annual NFL Reporter Roundtable, and Brooke Pryor is back for year 2. Brooke, of course, covers the Steelers and more for ESPN, and only appropriate that Dan Pizzuta, I mean, it's a week on the Hoffman Show, and so Dan's here because Dan joined us all season long.
Wow, and now you're here in the flesh, in real life.
We met for the first time 10 minutes ago, in real life, and we've literally had a weekly conversation about football.
Talked technically like 20 hours over the course of the year. Yeah, first time doing it in person.
Yeah,
wow.
So very exciting. I mean, we met here probably,
I think so.
Like 8 years ago at this point or something like that.
Wow.
More than we would care to admit.
Years? That explains why I feel the way I feel.
No, Brooke, it's because you're in Indianapolis.
That's also it. Yeah, there's something in the air here, and it's not good. I think it's the recycled air in the convention center that you just kind of like lose sense of time and place, and your brain goes to mush.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, Mike McDaniel said earlier, somebody asked him about like the schedule of the Combine. He said every day at the Combine is the same day. And that's the most true thing that any coach is going to say this week.
Yeah, every day is Blur's day. It's just, nope. I was in Phoenix yesterday. I was sitting, I probably tell this story too many times this week. Actually, I'm going to make this the one time I tell this story because this is like the right forum for it. So I'm sitting, and you, I think, especially as someone who travels a lot, like we'll get this, especially like some of the fast weekends or if you've done like a game weekend. I'm sitting in the Admirals Club, small flex, in the annual
Phoenix Admirals Club is not that
It's terrible.
Nice. It's horrendous.
By the way,
which sounds so stuck up, and I'm so sorry, but like
also,
of all the clubs,
it's like one of the American Airlines hubs. So American Airlines, not a sponsor, you could be. Also, fix your Admirals Club in Phoenix. But I'm sitting in the Admirals Club in Phoenix, ready to fly back to D.C., and I get my check-in notice for my flight from D.C. to Indianapolis. So that's where I was yesterday. Today I'm here to do this and a radio show and whatever else winds up happening. But the premise is, for those that are watching this for the first time, Dan, Brooke, and I are all going to pick a topic. We're going to top around each topic for about 10-ish minutes. And it's just a fun chance to zone out, take advantage of the fact that we get to sit here in person around a table and be three smart, hopefully, people to talk about football. Brooke's got doubts. I don't know if those doubts are about her or me. It's definitely not about
me.
Dan.
It's mostly me, my brain already being mush.
Yeah.
It's like I don't know that I'd call me a smart person at the moment. I'm an inquisitive person.
Okay, that works.
Questions.
Hey, curiosity goes a long way. And so it's a fun thing we did last year. Ben Solak was with us last year. Thrilled to have Dan this year. Brooke's like, I'm in again. Let's go. I don't even know if she remembers doing it last year.
I remember it.
Okay.
I take my role as a foundational member of the Reporter Roundtable very seriously.
Yes, that's what we're talking about. All right, Brooke, I am really fascinated in what I think you're going to bring to the table, unless you've changed your mind in the last hour since we were over back yonder at the podiums. So I want you to go first.
My big picture topic is how does coaching staff size correlate with success? Does having more coaches mean that you're going to go farther, mean that you're going to have a better season? Because there is such a discrepancy in coaching size. And granted, there is a cap on how many assistants you can have on the field, in the box, things like that. But in terms of just, quality control people, random analytics people, but also like game managers having passing game coordinators in addition to an offensive coordinator. Football in 2025 requires or has begun requiring so much specialization, and I'm so curious about how different teams utilize that specialization and how they also keep there from being too many cooks in the kitchen. How do you can you do more with less, or do you need to do more with more?
Yeah. Dan, I'm curious your thoughts on this.
I think the utilization part was the key there, because I think we have seen some teams try to get into, we're going to try to do a lot. Like the Cowboys have like one of the biggest analytics staffs in the league. Whether they're using that to their full extent, not totally sure.
Jerry's analytics are, I'm going to stick my finger up, see which way the wind's blowing.
We can pay everyone. Doesn't mean we're going to listen to what they're saying.
Except for the head coach. We're not going to pay the head coach.
Well, you have to cut corners somewhere.
Yeah, well.
But I think that is the big thing of how all of these ideas kind of come into come together to make sure they are being listened to. And I think that, the same thing with coaching staffs too, and, bringing some ideas, because I think there are still some head coaches in the league that even with smaller staffs still think they are the be-all, end-all and are not quite as open to new ideas. So I think it doesn't quite matter how big the staffs are, but if you have someone on top who is open to new ideas and bringing that type of conversation in, I think that's been the key, and I think that's how we've seen a lot of successful coaches being able to translate that to on-field success.
I think that's a great point, because if you're just listening to this audio only, then you didn't see the face I made when you said there are some head coaches that are the end-all be-all, and that's because the coach that I cover day in and day out is that kind of coach. I mean, the Steelers had the smallest coaching staff, I think maybe second only to the Colts, I believe, at least in terms of last year. But the interesting thing is they do have some coaches on staff that were not listed anywhere. Ryan Shazier and Vince Williams, two former players that were essentially, I think, volunteer assistants. But Mike Tomlin is someone that he wants to be involved in every part of the game. Even though he is a defensive coach, he very much is involved in the offense and how they're going to run it and being more conservative versus more aggressive. A couple years ago, they brought in Brian Flores on staff, and I thought that was a move in a great direction because they kind of created a role for him, and I thought maybe this is a step toward bringing more people to have more voices in the room. But once he left, they didn't replace him with anyone. So I think that it is very interesting and a good point that just because you hire a lot of people doesn't mean that you're necessarily benefiting from all of those ideas.
Right. And so this has become my answer on everything, which is if you're good at your job, then that's the answer, which I think is an interesting thing when I think about the team that I cover every day with Washington of, oh my God, is Josh Harris getting involved in this, that, or the other thing? And it's like, that's what Dan Snyder would do. It's like, yeah, except for Josh Harris isn't a moron. Like, Dan Snyder's an actual stupid person. And he showed it time and time again in every imaginable way, every conceivable way, on and off the field. And so Dan being involved in anything was bad. Josh is going to involve himself in the right way. Like, Josh is someone who is very smart. He, I think, understands sports, and that shows by the fact that the Devils are good, or at least last time I checked. I'm not a huge hockey guy, but they've certainly been good over the years and been better since he's been in charge. The Sixers, I know Embiid's falling apart, but like they won 50 games a bunch of times in a row and have been contenders legitimately for a long time. And arguably the worst hire he's made with the Sixers is Brian Colangelo. That blew up with all the the Twitter nonsense. But like that was kind of forced on them by the league, if you ask a lot of Sixers fans. So I think that like he has just shown an ability to hire the right people and then ask those people the right questions. Mm-hmm. And I think about a coaching staff, like DQ's great in part because he will take feedback from anywhere that's worth listening to. But he's smart enough to be able to suss out and kind of filter the information. And so I think that's like if you could handle that amount of cooks in the kitchen, and your kitchen is well run, it's worth having the extra cooks because that's a chance for extra ideas to come in. If you do not manage your kitchen well, then it's just a bunch of people throwing out ideas and they start sniping at each other and people get offended if their idea doesn't wind up being the one chosen. Like, there's a lot of egos in the league. So you have to be able to manage it. You have to be able to keep everyone on the same page. But if you can, then having smart people with good ideas is probably worth it.
I think the other point, too, that I think it was Mike McDaniel made, I talked to a bunch of different coaches today, and so they're all kind of running together, but one of them I talked to that has a bigger coaching staff said that for them having position assistants is incredibly important because it aids in the player development.
Yes.
Like, so much now is your success is dictated on can you hit on guys in the draft. So if you're going to draft these guys, they're not all going to be polished. So you need to have people in your building that can make a finished product, that can take the time to develop these guys. And I think that is a great point because I think that some of the coaching staffs that are smaller don't have the bandwidth to do all of the game planning and also the development part of it beyond what's just happening in practice. Just
real quick on that, I think of like some teams just have linebacker coaches and they have teams that are like 3-4 and you're like, those are two different positions. Like Ken Norton Jr. is the Commanders linebackers coach. He's one of the best linebackers coaches in the league for a decade and a half, and it's obviously like a Hall of Fame level linebacker himself as a player. Very different than Ryan Kerrigan, who's a pass rush coaching specialist for them. It like works with the edge players and like he was very good at that. But even like Dan, I think of DB's coaches, right? Of course, they have to work together, and a DB coach being in charge of a coverage game plan is smart, but coaching corners and coaching safeties is two very, very, very different set of skills. And if I can have someone with nuance to help my player development in both of those areas, why wouldn't I have two assistant DB coaches, one with each focus on my staff?
Yeah, I think that's kind of the thing there that I've been thinking about during this conversation is just making sure everyone is on the same page and knowing exactly what is needed. Like even from, coming from the front office and when you are drafting these players, knowing that those are the type of guys that your position coaches or the coordinators want to use and be able to do that. Because I think there's still, in a lot of teams, still a big disconnect of who they are bringing in. And then, again, you're asking a cornerbacks coach who is being asked by the coach to teach one way, and the front office has brought in a guy who that's not necessarily his strength. So I think we do see there is some of that disconnect. So just from the top down, just having this ability to know exactly what everyone should be doing and having everything just kind of be a cohesive thing is so important that it seems like when we say it, it's so obvious.
Right.
But it doesn't
none of
work
this stuff
that
is
way.
like
No.
none of this stuff is revolutionary
It's
in
not
any way.
It literally isn't rocket science.
But executing on it is apparently way harder than we would think because the principle is just not that difficult. I'd be curious covering Pittsburgh, though, like that alignment between front office and coaching staff. Would you say that's like a benefit of a smaller staff? Is like, okay, well, it's less people, we got to get on the same page. And so at the very least, even though we might have a con over here, like we have that pro of we got everybody moving in the right direction.
Right. I mean, that is part of it. I mean, that's how Mike Tomlin wants his staff. Like, he does not want a bigger staff. Art Rooney does not want Mike Tomlin to have a bigger staff. I mean, I asked him point blank this year if that was something, if increasing staff size was a way that they could get out of this kind of rut that they're in, which I know it's crazy to say rut when they haven't had a season below 500, but when you haven't won a playoff game since 2016, it's a rut for this organization.
Right.
And Art Rooney was very adamant that increasing staff size is not the answer. And I found that fascinating that why not exhaust all options? I mean, is it a matter of you don't want to pay more people, or is it a matter of like Mike Tomlin wants his hands on everything all the time?
That's the funny thing thinking about like DQ, and it's funny because DQ and Tomlin go way back. They were, I think DQ was like a graduate assistant for when Tomlin was in college. I think that's the story. So like those two guys are cut from very similar cloths in a lot of ways, defensive coaches, CEO types. But like, I think if you have a personality as big as Tomlin's and as big as DQ's, and as big is not really the word I'm looking for. It's like somewhere between big, commanding, whatever, defined. Maybe that's a good word for it. A personality as defined and an identity as defined as those guys. It's actually not that hard to have your hands in everything because everyone feels like they're executing your vision. Like that is at the end of the day what really good leadership is all about. And so I think it's kind of funny that Tomlin might be like, no, I don't want to have too many people around. And like, I get it on one level, but that's actually, I think, him underselling his own abilities to keep everybody in the building together.
Well, I think it's also harder to keep everybody in the building together when you haven't had a lot of success recently. So it's harder, I think, to get people to buy into your vision when your vision is leading to first-round playoff losses for almost, like, we're getting dangerously close to saying decade.
Yeah, which is wild.
Yeah, and it's just kind of one of those things where it does take the right guy to be able to have your hands in everything. Because, like, I think we've seen, over the past, 2 decades with, like, Belichick assistants who have tried to be Bill Belichick and try to have their hand in everything. And 0 of them have been capable of doing it. So I think like that is, just having the ability to know what you can and can't do, I think is very important. And again, it's not something that I think everyone who is trying to be a head coach or has that ability has the self-awareness to try to reflect. And I think the ones that do are the guys that we've seen, be successful.
Yeah, and I think to wrap this up, like there's no doubt just alignment, to use one of Dan and Adam's favorite words, like the alignment between coaching and front office of like, okay, I'm not going to be able to be over everything, but we want the consistency between the two sides of the house. Like that's really essential to success for sure. All right, DP, what you bringing to the table for the roundtable?
All right, my question is, are teams going to start and really continue to be more aggressive pursuing top-level talent in trades because free agency has been kind of mellowed out a little bit especially over the past couple years. We know, top tier free agents don't really happen. There's no star player who reaches free agency. So if they're good, their teams are going to resign them. Teams like the Eagles are resigning them as early as humanly possible to where they're in great deals. So we don't see, T. Higgins was going to be the number one guy this year. He's probably getting franchised. We see that stuff all the time. So if you are looking for that type of player, is a trade something that teams are going to be a little more aggressive, giving away draft capital and being willing to give the extension also outside of that in order to get that type of talent? And I think we see, a Myles Garrett is someone that Washington is going to be very interested in. That
is very interested in, no doubt about it. I think it's a great question, and I'm glad you brought up Garrett at the end here, because I think there's two categories here. I think there's like Garrett / quarterbacks, and then there's everybody else. Because there's, for Myles Garrett, it might cost you multiple firsts. And he's probably the only defensive player outside of Micah Parsons in the league. I think those are the two. Maybe the only two non-quarterbacks in the league that I would even consider that for.
What about TJ?
I think TJ's too old at this point.
Yeah.
He's what, 31, 32?
I think right around 30.
Myles is 29, and Myles had been banged up a little bit, but TJ's been hurt consistently, and TJ, if you tell me it's one game, TJ's right up there with those guys for sure. But I know it's just 1 year, but the way that they have aged, Myles, the fact that he is an alien from outer space and is not built like the rest of us, his age, I look at him as 27, not 29, right?
I think that's fair.
And so I think for Myles, for Micah, if he were to come on the market at his age with what he's done, and then the quarterbacks, where it's multiple first-round picks, that one's harder. Because then, if that piece does not play exactly like you want, now you're at a huge disadvantage. That said, I'd probably still make the deal for 2 firsts for Myles Garrett if I'm Washington, but that's also in part because I don't have to worry about quarterback because I have him and I have him on the rookie deal and the whole deal. I think for everyone else, I feel like teams steal guys all the time. You're telling me, especially if you're a team that's looking to win now and you have the cap space to do it, that even a second round pick is going to be more productive than a top-flight player right now. And I understand the cost difference. I understand why the trades happen the way they do, and often they can work for both sides because the team that is trading, that timeline might not fit them. Okay, well, we'd rather have the second-round pick because we're trying to be good 2-3 years from now. But, I think people forget, and especially in Washington, I'm talking to you, all Commanders fans, we forget how good rookies are not because Jaden just broke our brains on everything. But, rookies can be great players. But if you were trying to win right now, I don't want to rely on rookies. I probably want guys on rookie deals. I don't want rookies. And so I think that there's a real, I won't say market inefficiency, but there's a chance for two teams to make a really good deal on both sides that I would say, Dan, is probably correct.
Yeah, I'm all for it. That what makes the NFL more like the NBA. It's more exciting to see big-name players on the move. I do think that it's interesting you bring up the quarterback point as far as how much does it affect what quarterbacks move, what teams can move. I think that if teams have a quarterback in place, they are in a much better position to be aggressive with everything else. Last year, the Steelers tried to get Brandon Ayuk. It made a ton of sense because it felt like at the time the team was a wide receiver away because they had Fields and Wilson. I don't know that I necessarily agreed with that, but that's how they saw it.
Right. One of these two guys is going to work.
Exactly, but it's kind of
hilariously, that's still where they are. One of these two guys, we don't know which one. We'll bring one of them back.
We are just on a merry-go-round. It is Groundhog Day. Every day at the Combine's the same. Every Steelers season is the same. But I do think that it's showing, to your point, guys are not coming available in free agency. Either you draft them or you have to move mountains to get them in a trade. Those are the options now. There is not an open market the way that there used to be, and so something has to give. If the most capital you have is draft picks, send them, trade them. I'm all for it. I was against the Christian McCaffrey trade when it happened because I felt like it was a luxury trade at the time. They didn't really need him, but that turned out to be a huge difference maker for them when his Achilles are fine.
I think that's a good point, too, because same thing with it got said about Jahmyr Gibbs to Detroit as a draft pick. No matter how you're spending prime capital on something that seems like a luxury, If you're right, it doesn't matter. It goes back to my initial thing in the last part of the conversation. Yeah, if you're good, nothing else matters. Just be good. Be good at what you do.
I think that's kind of one of the things where if you can get one of these players, and I think I was one of the few people who really liked, and especially as someone who is very like analytics focused also, I think in the minority of this Christian McCaffrey trade is actually good because it is like a force multiplier for, especially in that Shanahan scheme. Like if the Steelers had done it, I would have been, no, that doesn't make sense.
Right.
They would never
But
do
if it fits, and because I think that was something that certainly opened up what the 49ers were able to do. And I think that is kind of the big thing that I also thought about for these trades, like especially during this Rams run where they were in the F them picks type of thing, when they were giving up these draft picks for like a Jalen Ramsey, it made building the rest of the roster so much easier, because when you are looking for what you need in a fourth round pick, he only needs to be doing this very specific thing because you already have these star players elsewhere who are taking up such an outsized responsibility in the defense. And, you know, when you can build around Jalen Ramsey and Aaron Donald, 32 teams would want to do that, so it doesn't always work. But when you are kind of taking those swings on that top tier talent, it does increase the margin of error you have for trying to get some of these later round picks, these rookie deal players, to be able to be useful players for you. So I think it does also help you there. And Craig, you said like you don't want to say market inefficiency, but I think it still is, because I do think there is still too much of a discount for high salary players in the draft picks they are getting back, because I think, you know, maybe 20 teams are very smart about the salary cap, I would say, and there are enough smart teams that they are figuring out how to get some of these big guys on these higher cap hits. And especially when you trade for someone, you're not taking on their signing bonus.
Right.
It's only going to be their salary. So you're usually getting them at a discount also. The way you can restructure that after they're acquired, I think there are still a lot of avenues where you are getting a market inefficiency by trying to trade for some of these guys.
No, I think that's right. And, you know, I think the value obviously changes. Like, hey, sorry, if you're GM1, I'm GM2, and it's like, hey, I got to give this guy an extension the second that we trade him. Like, I don't want to necessarily give up that. But I think the other part about it, too, is then, okay, one of the ways that you avoid the pitfalls that some teams fall into is just have a bunch of picks. If draft picks are a lottery, okay, I want the most picks possible. And that way, if I miss on 50% of 8 picks versus 50% of 16 picks, I have 4 versus 8 good players. I can trade back. And that's the thing where I think sometimes teams will actually go too far all in. Is like, can you split that difference of, I'm going to make the trade, maybe I give up even if I give up a first. Okay, well, now I'm going to trade back in the second round, and I'm going to get 2/3 or whatever. I'm going to get a future, whatever. And you still come out of, let's say, not even just one draft, but especially 2 drafts with like the right amount of picks. There's enough maneuverability in the draft to take the swings. Are you going to have as high of a chance of hitting as the first round pick? No. But also, I would say this, too. Like, if you're Washington this year, you're picking at 29. And, like, not that you can't get a great player at 29, not that you can't get a really useful player that can contribute now, or a high ceiling player, big swing, whatever. You can get that player at 29, but it's a hell of a lot easier to do it at 15 or 10 or 8. So saying trading, for Washington specifically and Garrett, if I'm trading the 29th and 30th picks, let's say they make the Super Bowl next year, 31st pick, and they lose the Super Bowl next year. Hey, screw it. Let's say they win the Super Bowl next year. And I'm trading the 29th and 32nd pick. That's basically 2 second-round picks for Myles Garrett. What are you complaining about?
Yeah.
And so I think you have to also realize, and this is where, you know, we talk about egos and people getting in trouble. Like, you have to be realistic about where you are. And if you're trading, if you're the Chicago Bears a couple years ago, or the Carolina Panthers a couple years ago, and you trade away next year's first, and then that winds up being 1 overall in the Caleb Williams draft, that's because you were bad at your job. You weren't realistic about what you were actually trading away. And everyone knew it at the time that was stupid, except for apparently the Panthers. If you're Washington now and you're like, we're pretty sure this Daniels guy's going to be pretty good. If you're Houston, even if you're trading away stuff, you're like, all right, CJ, we might have a little bit down year, but like we're probably picking at least in the 20s, if not the late 20s. If you are obviously Kansas City, Baltimore, Buffalo, very, very different equation on the math.
I mean, a great example that the Steelers did this when they traded for Minkah Fitzpatrick. Like,
Yep.
in some ways, they were kind of early adopters of this trend if it continues. And they had it was a early to mid 20s, because they always pick early to mid 20s. They knew that Minkah was a known quantity, and they, before that, had never traded a first round pick. I think maybe like in the 70s or something, but like it had been a while, because they looked at it and they said, well, we know that we can get a guy that like is going to contribute right away. He plug and play. We think our roster is right there, that our first round pick's not going to be that high. We just need somebody on the back end. Unfortunately, that deal got done the day after Ben Roethlisberger like blew his elbow out, and then everything kind of went downhill from there. But like at the time, I think that was a very smart trade. I think it is still a smart trade. I don't know that Minkah is being necessarily utilized in the right way or being utilized most effectively. But I still think that given, I mean, the Steelers have a terrible history of drafting first-round DBs. I think it's a great trade. And that year, they talked a lot about, like, Minkah Fitzpatrick is our first-round pick. Yeah, pretty much.
And the cost is different, but I think it also then depends on your cap situation, and that goes to like kind of the impetus that you talked about with this to begin with, of like you have the Eagles doing this at the absolute extreme, but a lot of other teams too are starting to extend guys early. And if your owner is willing to pay that signing bonus in cash early, then you are going to wind up, by the time 2 years later that you would have signed that guy to an extension when you had to, just look at how the market's growing year over year, especially because the cap's gone up 20% in 2 straight years. So these extensions are so much, like you go from, oh my God, we signed Devontae Smith to a near top of the market deal to like, he's, what is he, probably the 28th highest paid receiver or something like that in the league? Like, he's not even close to the top of the market. And Philly just won the Super Bowl in part because of it, because they had room to sign Saquon Barkley. They had room to do some of the other stuff. They'll have room to, keep one of the, if they want to re-sign Bond or Milton Williams, like they probably can't do all of it. Darn it, Howie, you drafted too many good players. You actually broke the system.
What a shameful problem.
I know. But like, they've been able to make it work as well as anybody because of how they've gone about that.
Yeah, and I think like the Eagles and some of the misconceptions about what the Rams did during that time is kind of going back to like what you said of being able to know who you are and what you are looking for, because the Rams were still a team, while they were trading away those first round picks, still always trading back in day 3, taking those swings also to, like you said,
you're talking about a market inefficiency, future picks. Like teams will trade a 7th for a future 6th.
That's
and it's
the
like,
other thing. Yep.
Why would you do that? You just traded a 7th round for a 6th pick, like a 6th rounder. Why would you do that?
Yeah.
But they do.
Then that is the thing. I think these smart teams are figuring out where they can get some of those edges in trades, and and that is the way where I think you kind of do have to get some of the better players. Like even just today, like Khalil Shakir signed an extension for the Bills, which he would be a great receiver once he gets to the free agent market. But after 3 years right now, he's already locked up. So that's taking away that type of guy who would be able to he's already underpaid, to go on a complete different tangent from what he signed. Should be getting like double what he signed in Buffalo. But it's those type of players, and we see teams like that are just being more aggressive, locking those types of players up, and they're just not hitting the market. So trying to get the guys in trades, and sometimes they're going to be 28, 29. But if you are a team who needs that top end talent, I think it's worth the risk.
For sure. All right, I was debating on switching up the question, because I think I've talked about this with you in varying ways on the show this year, but I'm going to stick with it, and we can, now that we've got a little room for the season, we can zone out. I'm really interested in your answer on this. I'm going to ask literally everyone that sits down this question, so I can't let you guys then be immune from it.
That's fair.
But
That's fair.
The Commanders had one of the most unexpected seasons we have ever seen in the history of the league. And because so much changed, there were so many different things, from, if we count really 2 years worth of change with the ownership year, I call like the last Rivera year 0, because they got in the day the season started.
Yeah.
They couldn't change anything outside of like some paint on the walls. So really this is year 1 of new ownership, new GM, new head coach, rookie quarterback. So like the 4 pillars of a franchise that you want to be successful, they all changed basically from bad to good in one season. And I think it was a really interesting look at the league in that way of like, okay, which of these factors are acting upon each other? Like what's actually working here? But then also how Dan and Adam specifically rounded out that roster around Jaden. So my all that preamble to wind up into, like, what's the thing you take out of what Washington did this year that, if this is not putting it too largely, changes the way you look at the NFL and how winners are built? Dan, or Brooke, you want a second to think and let Dan go, or is there something that popped in mind?
Go ahead.
Long pause. I need more time.
That's fine. Yeah, because we have talked about this a little bit. What Washington's season comes down to me is having a clear plan from like day one that stretches out across everything. Kind of we talked about it through free agency, where, you know, as we just talked about, there's not a lot of high-end free agents. So Washington didn't go out and try to make the biggest splash. They got a lot of players who were going to help them be competent, which is something Washington was not able to do. So you were able to kind of round out that roster in guys that were just good at their jobs, which definitely helped. And then when you are, I think what we don't see a lot with young quarterbacks, and when you compare like what Washington did with what like Chicago did this year, watching Hard Knocks as someone who was up close with Washington and seeing what they were doing with Jaden versus then watching what the Bears did was one of the like most mind-bending experiences that I can remember as a football consumer. And like we talked about it like almost every week at the start of the season, how there was just the day one offense that they had, even in week one, did not look anything like the week 3 offense, which didn't look anything like the week 8 offense by the time. And there was a very regimented, just kind of development plan that they had, just unveiling things and opening up the offense as Jaden got comfortable. They figured out what could work in week 1, and then by the end of the regular season, it was a fully like functional Death Star that looked like it was very just kind of compact in week 1, but that was clearly a plan that they had. So being able to kind of just have that type of development plan in place and really understanding what your guy can do, not putting too much on his plate, which I think is what we see with a lot of these young quarterbacks. Is I think we saw it in Houston. CJ Stroud, you're really good. Go handle everything for us.
Here are the keys.
And I think they did that with Caleb Williams in Chicago too. Oh, you can set protections. Go ahead, do that in week 1.
Right.
That's an insane thing for a rookie quarterback to be doing. So I think just having that and allowing him to grow at his own pace is such a big thing that not enough teams, I think, have really been able to accomplish.
100%. I'm going to go big picture. The thing that I take away from the way that Washington overhauled everything is that ownership matters a ton. Having a smart owner, having an owner that welcomes feedback, having an owner that is just willing to try things and knows what his limits are. Like, to me, that is so important, especially when you see how like things went down with the Jets, when you have an ownership group coming in that's like, hey, we're going to let my kids' Madden ratings have some kind of dictate somewhat of the players, the roster.
My favorite
like
NFL story of the year.
And not even
100%.
like a good Madden rating. It was awareness?
Right. That is wildly subjective. But to me, it shows, and I mean, Washington knows this better than any team, how much ownership matters. But I think the biggest thing is just knowing what you're good at and surrounding yourself with people who, going back to building coaching staffs, people who, if you have a blind spot on something, then you bring in someone who that is their area of expertise. I mean, I go back to during the season, I did a story on the Commanders doing rally towels when the Steelers were there. That was one of the minority owners. I can't remember his name off the top of my head, but a fan DM'd him and said, hey, when the Steelers come to town, we should try rally towels because I was tired of seeing the yellow towels take over.
Right.
And it didn't work, but the owner said, yeah, you know what? Let's try it. Why not?
Yeah,
and to me,
it was better than it was otherwise.
Exactly. And it got the fan base excited. To me, it just shows there is, I don't think that humble is the right word, but it's at least a willingness to learn and a willingness to acknowledge.
There's definitely humility to it.
Yes, I think there is. And I think that goes so far, and you build so much trust and just a relationship with the people you work with, that I think the vibes are so much better. And like, I hate to like reduce a good season down to vibes, but like that is a part of it.
I mean, I'm glad you said that because it's kind of my thing is like, of course there is like to go to the NFC Championship game the way they did, right? To not just like turn the corner and be like, oh, they went 9-8. Like, hey, they showed signs of life. They're not dead anymore. Watch out. Like, and you could have good vibes around the building. You need the schematic element. You need all of the football stuff. You need Jaden to be magical and play at a borderline MVP level. Like, all of that stuff has to go right. So it's not that one or the other is, I don't want to say the most important, because I do think in some ways the vibes are the most important, because those are the things that are going to carry for like beyond when Jaden is gone, which is hopefully 20 years from now. But like, having a distinct directive of ownership of how you want to run the franchise and a general manager and the head coach being on the same page. And I think that like my takeaway is actually a really clarifying example of something that I've thought for a long time with football, which is like you are better off having 11 with an inferior plan than the best schematic whatever and 10 guys doing it right and one guy messing it up. And that is true on the field. And I'm sure you see stuff every week when you're watching film the way you do. You were like, man, that play design was sick. Too bad, the wide receiver 2 ran the wrong route like a doofus. Like messed it all up, brought a DB underneath. Like sometimes a quarterback throws a pick because a guy that wasn't even the intended receiver did something wrong, brought a DB in. That guy's not supposed to be there, whatever, right? Yeah. So there's like the obvious schematic side of it. But genuinely having everybody in the building have a competitive spirit that is healthy and channeled in a particular way, and having everybody moving in the same direction is something that I think is an irreplaceable part of a successful franchise. And I think people like undersold it to an extent because we don't really have many examples of that in Washington sports at all. The way that the Wizards have been for a long time, and they're trying. It's funny because the Wizards do not have the talent, but they are trying to build that thing right now. It matters less because most of the guys that are actually playing basketball for them probably won't be here when they're good. But like they are at least in the building the way they do about their business day to day. It's like, this is what it means to be a part of our franchise. The Nationals, like they were, did whatever they did in 2019. Capitals, Ovi's been the prime driver of that for a long time, whatever. But like a team that is like truly culture built in the way that Washington had or was this year, because the thing is, I think, to kind of land this plane is it affects everything else, right? It affected who was the number one quarterback on their board. They legitimately had Jaden over Caleb and would have taken him at number one because of, not that Caleb is like a scrub or whatever, but like that's who Jaden was. He was the perfect leader for what they wanted, the perfect competitor for what they wanted. It affected who they went after in free agency, not just from good schematic fits, but like they wanted Dante Fowler because Dante Fowler knew how Dan Quinn got down. They wanted Bobby Wagner because he's Bobby freaking Wagner on and off the field. They wanted Zach Ertz because of how much of a pro. Like it just affected every single thing that they did in a way that you kind of tangentially know or like theoretically get. But man, when you see it every single day in the way that I saw it this year, and I'm sure that you see it in Pittsburgh and you've seen it with some of the teams that you've been around, like it's a totally different beast. Yeah,
I think culture is something that is very easy to write off, but something that very clearly matters.
I think it's so funny because like Rivera talked about culture all the time, but he was bad at it. And like there's every coach talks about it. What are the ones that are actually good at developing it?
Right. I mean, Mike Tomlin is a great example of the teams that he's had that have stayed above 500. The culture is a huge piece of why they were able to do that. And when you look at the way that this last season ended with 5 straight losses, you could feel in the building that they were missing that the vibes were bad. Like the vibes in that 3-game and 10-day stretch were so bad, and they snowballed. And I think that as much as, we talk about quarterback intangibles, I think ownership intangibles, just intangibles in general, matter a lot. And I think that we overlook it so much because it's an intangible and you can't put a number on it. You can't quantify it, but it's real.
And then it affects, let's talk about it affects everything else. Like think of why we're all here, right? Theoretically, this is a draft event. You wouldn't know it by looking around at this media circus. But like, when we talk about, that guy, or next week in free agency or 2 weeks, whenever that is, it's like, is that guy fit in this place? It's like, on the tape he might. That guy's a perfect 4-3, edge setting, whatever. It's like, okay, well, how does he go about his work every day? And like, it's hard for us to know from the outside, but knowing how much they value that on the inside will make me, I think much less declarative, and they have to go get this guy. Oh, why did they pass on that guy? They're so stupid. And we find out 3 years later it's because the guy like didn't really try that hard.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the hard things to
Mr. Top 100 list, et cetera, et cetera.
So I was honestly just going to say that. Like, personally, I would much rather be writing about how these guys fit when they sign than a top 100 list beforehand. It's not what my editors asked for, but it's what I'll do because of it.
It's very helpful for those of us that are like, hey, by the way, who are the top 100 free agents?
I
So thank you for your service.
In terms of actually finding out how these guys are going to play, it's so much more important to where they are landing, what they're going to be asked to do, how they are able to fit into the culture, this scheme, their specific role. It is definitely like going back to like Sam Darnold. He signs with the Raiders this year. Not going to be super excited about it.
I'm intrigued though because of Pete though, because like Pete's a culture setter. Like it's a totally different thing than if he signs with them 2 years ago.
But culture's fine, but he's going to be asked to, I think, do a lot more than he was in Minnesota when you're not throwing to Justin Jefferson, Jordan Addison, and having Kevin O'Connell run that offense. Like, that's why I thought that would work once he was declared the starter.
Right.
So I think there are a lot of things like that where a guy like Kevin O'Connell is one, he has that great culture, but also has this ability to make sure these guys are playing to their strengths and they have the players to do it. So I think there is a lot of that. So, and going back to Washington, the vibes, it's not even as if it was just like we missed the vibes. It was going from the worst vibes in the league to great vibes. So like the swing there was so huge. Yeah. And I think like that was a misinterpreted thing of how much that could be played out just because it started so low.
I think there's a soccer podcast called Good Vibes FC. You might as well just made that the Commanders this year. All right, last thing, Brooke, because my live show starts in 8 minutes.
Oh, man. Well, I was just going to say that everything that Dan just said goes back to having a plan from day one. Like, you know what vibes you want to have. So we're going to find guys. We're going to hire people on staff, assistants that all go back into having those good vibes. So, and it
100%.
goes back to what you were saying, everybody in concert. So basically, the key to running a successful franchise is good vibes.
Yeah, good vibes. Good vibes. Make sure you're good people who are happy all the time, and they'll never be bad at their jobs.
And then you have Russell Wilson, so I would maybe maybe not happy all the time.
Maybe we do. Maybe just there's a Russell Wilson segment in year 3 next year. So see you next year?
Yeah, see you next year.
See you next year.
I'll be here.
All right, Reporter Roundtable, year 2. That was great. Brooke Pryor, Dan Pizzuta with me, Craig Hoffman, here live from Indianapolis. We got plenty more coverage coming from Indy on the Hoffman Show. Also take command. See you then. See you there. We're done for this.
Hey, this is DA, and you're listening to The Hoffman Show on the Team 980 and the Odyssey app.